What's up? I'm SYROBE. Before we get into the build, isn't it funny how when the DLC first released, the narrative surrounding it was almost too difficult and had people quitting? Well, I hate to break it to anyone who still thinks that, but Elden Ring has always been an unbalanced mess since day one, and the DLC is no exception. Bosses can get crazy, but builds always get crazier. It's kind of the point I've tried to prove with my entire channel since day one of Elden Ring's release, even for today's video, which is an honest yet equally broken build that is actually more balanced and practical compared to my previous builds, but still extremely powerful. This is the ultimate hand-to-hand Elden Ring DLC Dryleaf Arts guide, comparing both the Dryleaf Arts and the Dane's Footwork, as well as comparing their Ash of War's Palm Blast and Whirlwind. These weapons also have unique weapon Ash of War combos that can easily reach over thousands of damage with no buffs. On my level 155 base new game character, one lets you gain an ungodly amount of hyper armor that allows you to ignore almost every attack that would flip you like a pancake. The other one lets you almost instantly apply status effects with high DPS. But first off, let's do some power scaling. Which of these two hand-to-hand weapons do you think is better? There are only two hand-to-hand weapons you can obtain: the standard Dryleaf Arts shortly after Alana's boss room, and the Dane's Footwork, which is tied to an endgame NPC questline. Personally, I prefer the regular Dryleaf Art hands instead of the Dane's Footwork because the hand weapon is extremely close in DPS and its poise damage values are higher than the Dane's Footwork. And the Dane's Footwork is also an endgame item past the point of no return for the DLC, while the Dryleaf Arts can be accessed extremely early. Both of these hand-to-hand weapons even have the exact same attribute scaling, giving them the exact same total AR as each other as long as you make them the same affinity. Even their motion values are very similar, but from what I can tell, the Dane's Footwork seems to have slightly stronger motion values for some specific attacks, like the two-handed charge heavy attacks. Basically means a two-handed charge heavy on the Dane's Footwork deals a little more damage than the same two-handed charge heavy input on the Dryleaf Arts, despite them having the exact same input, scaling stats, and base damage. It's also important to note that as a new category of weapon, the hand-to-hand weapon still functions similarly to the claws or fist weapons, which means once you equip the weapon, if you use your input for two-handing weapons, you get a new moveset with the single weapon being held in each hand. I don't blame you if you didn't notice that you can two-hand them, because if you have gauntlets on, you can't even see them, and you can only tell by looking at your weapons HUD. Two-handing the Dryleaf Arts hands felt way better than trying to power stance them, which ends up being the same for the Dane's Footwork. No need to power stance the hand-to-hand weapons, since it just works similarly to something like the Star Fist, where one Star Fist is all you need, because two-handing it gives you one in each hand anyways, whereas power stancing doesn't really do anything. Some people say you might be able to use power stancing as a combo extender if you have the hands in the right slot and the feet in your left slot, but I haven't truly noticed a difference. Once again, the Dryleaf Arts deal a little less overall damage than the Dane's Footwork, but only for some very specific attack inputs. But despite that, the Dryleaf Arts actually have higher poise damage against bosses, which ends up being a lot more consistent, and personally, it feels like the hands attack a little bit faster than the feet. The Dane's Footwork just felt a tad bit slower for its regular attacks, in my opinion. As far as poise damage goes, the Dane's Footwork two-hand charge attack did deal more damage to enemies, but it only had around 28 total poise damage, while the Dryleaf Arts two-hand charge attack dealt 31 poise damage, but less regular damage. These charge attacks were fairly consistent, showing that the Dane's Footwork two-handed charge heavy attacks dealt less poise damage on average. So while the Dane's Footwork still has slightly higher DPS for some very specific attacks, the regular Dryleaf Arts hand weapon has almost the same damage, with more poise damage on the two-hand charge attacks. For me, the hands feel like they have a faster moveset, offer higher poise damage values, two stance break bosses and enemies faster, so I prefer the Dryleaf Arts along with its ease of access, and it feels like the Dane's Footwork has a different moveset with similar damage and less poise damage on some attacks, and since Dane's Footwork is locked behind a late game quest past the point of no return, really makes it not all that worth it in my opinion. But the Ashes of War is where things get weird and spice this build up a lot. I only found two unique Ash of Wars for hand-to-hand weapons. Both hand-to-hand weapons can have other Ashes of War applied to them, like Bloodhound Step or Poison Flower Blooms twice. So I looked up to see if I was missing any more unique ashes for the hand-to-hand weapons. Specifically, I caught wind of another YouTuber by the name of Yui, who covered this Ash of War before me, known as Palm Blast. But they mentioned that the Palm Blast has 10 stance damage when lightly pressed, and 36 damage when fully charged. However, I noticed Palm Strike was actually consistently 20 poise damage when lightly pressed, and not 10. I don't know why the poise damage is inconsistent in Elden Ring, but my guess is that it has something to do with the hitboxes for the melee portion or the bullet portion of the Ash of War. Not sure sure, but at the very least, the most consistent tests I had did show the Palm Blast dealing 20 poise damage on average for a light tap, and 36 poise damage for a full charge, which the second part is the same that the other creator got. Again, this is not to fault them in any way. Elden Ring is full of really weird inconsistencies, and there was a patch that came out recently, so it can be possible that the Palm Blast was stealth buffed in some way. Great work from them regardless, and I'll leave their tier list in the video description for you guys to check out. The other Ash of War for the Dryleaf Whirlwind poise damage varied as well. It was on average 28 total poise damage. It had around 8 poise damage on the initial hit, and up to 28 if you landed all of their strikes from it. 28 poise damage was the most consistent on average for every hitbox landed. I made sure I wasn't missing any and kept getting 28, but very rarely sometimes I even tested and got 36, and even once got 44 poise damage from a single use of the Whirlwind, even when I use it the exact same way. So Elden Ring numbers can be a little bit skewed and inconsistent when you actually test them and use them in the game, on top of the fact that you can actually get cancelled out of the Whirlwind Ash of War before it hits. So as far as the unique Ash of Wars go, I think the true winner here is Palm Blast. It does an average of 36 total poise damage and over 1,000 damage in the base game and over 3,000 damage in the DLC, all without using any buffs. I did that on purpose just to show you guys that this build is insanely strong regardless of what you do. The Ash of War Palm Blast also gives you an ungodly amount of hyper armor. Like I mentioned earlier, and what most people didn't realize is that during this state you actually do get increased defensive stats as well, which is a little bit less than Endure. So it really does encourage you, with its seemingly infinite hyper armor and increased defensive stats, to laugh in the faces of the demigods and give them a lesson in skill issue. This is how I would set up each hand-to-hand weapon. Dane's Footwork I prefer to have Whirlwind Ash of War on, and the Dryleaf Art's hand I use Palm Blast. It's a little weird since they both actually spawn with Palm Blast. You'd think the foot weapon would get the kicking Ash of War by default, but you have to actually find that. Here are my stats and gear for my Dryleaf Whirlwind build on the Dane's Footwork. Starting as a Samurai class, I have 65 dex and 45 int for the main stat changes. The Cold Affinity has B tier scaling, but you get diminishing returns for int weapon scaling a lot faster than for dex, so our main stat will be dex here. If you have any extra points, crank up strength and intelligence even more. For the affinity, I prefer Frostbite, but you can choose bleed since its Ash of War can build up status effects extremely fast. It does count as multi-hit, which synergizes with Millicent's or Rotten Wing, and even the Thorny Crack tier. Considering the Cold Affinity gets over 100 buildup, and the bleed requires investments in Arcane to build up more, I prefer Cold here as well, because it still has an extremely fast applicator that when procced, Frostbite reduces enemy defensive stats, which is very solid for rapid multi-hit kicks, and multi-hit Talisman stacking with the Alexander Shard. And did you know that this Kicking Stone Talisman also boosts the regular attacks from Dane's Footwork? It even boosts the Whirlwind Ash of War damage since they both use kicking attacks. If you want to go for a bleed build, you can use the White Mask and Lord of Blood Talisman for extra bonus damage, so do as you please. For the Dryleaf Art's hand wraps, I like to use the Palm Blast with the same stats since I really like Cold, and as I mentioned before, both weapons have the exact same base damage on the same affinities, but even without Whirlwind, you still can build up Frostbite fairly quickly, and it gives you more damage for your Ash of War Palm Blast when fully charged into the Frostbite enemy debuff. However, our Talisman will change, keeping the Shard of Alexander, but using the Godfrey icon. I tested and discovered this does work extremely well with our Ash of War. I tried the Turtle Talisman for extra stamina regen since this build kinda eats stamina, and the Axe Talisman for our charge attacks. The difference in this build is that we are playing for boss poise breaks. Our two-hand charge heavy attack gives 31 poise damage when the Palm Blast gives 36 poise damage. So you can combo the charge attack open into the Palm Blast for a nice combo of 67 instant poise damage. This can be increased if you take the Stone Barb Crack tier for even more poise damage. Also, I forgot to mention, but in both flasks, I do use the Opaline Hard tier because I think it's very underrated for close melee range builds like this one to keep you extra safe. Again, feel free to add any buffs to make this build stronger. I didn't want to add any so that you can all see the true power of the martial arts without any buffs, and that not everything in this DLC is extremely broken or cheesy, and that it's really buffs that allow builds to be crazy in the first place. But of course, if you did add a few buffs, you could easily achieve around 10,000 damage in a single Palm Blast. The scaling on it is extremely overpowered, as well as the hyper armor and increased defensive stats. So if you want to know specifically what I'd recommend for the newer players to go, start with the Dryleaf Hands Palm Blast build, and for the more experienced players who want a harder challenge, go with the Dane's Footwork and the Whirlwind Ash of War. Either build is extremely fun to use and very strong. So I hope you all enjoyed. Please leave a like and subscribe for more builds in the future. I also live stream on YouTube almost every other day, so feel free to check me out here for some live testing and challenge runs for Elden Ring and the DLC. I've been SYROBE, and I'll see you all in my next video. Peace.